Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my research here, and it is about technology and about young children. This is my first time in Salt Lake City, and I must say I really enjoy it here. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go out for some skiing, although I have been skating on the Olympic Oval, which was great fun. Good ice. Well, you know, there are a couple of weird people on the world, Norwegians, Dutch, and some Russians, and they skate. Okay, I'm affiliated with the University of Stavanger in Norway, and I'm currently on sabbatical in the Netherlands. And that's the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies. The research was carried out together with Jenny Sandvik, and this is Jenny and her kids, and unfortunately I have her only part-time. Good. I'll give you straight away the summary, and then you can all go back to bed. Or we can decide to carry on for a couple of minutes. Anyway, we'll see. We looked at 35 studies that were published in peer-reviewed journals over the last 10 years. And we looked at any sort of multimedia intervention, and that was aimed at improving literacy skills of children at risk. So that was the definition of our search. And in fact, what we found is embedded multimedia. That means that a teacher uses some sort of multimedia together with the traditional curriculum. We found studies that dealt with TV, so either educational TV programs or things like subtitling and effects on literacy. Of course, e-books and computer-assisted instruction. Those were the main categories. And we found large effects for phonological awareness, concept of print, medium effects for comprehension, non-word reading, that means decoding, and no effects for vocabulary, reading, and alphabetic knowledge. And it was inconclusive for spelling and for syntax. So that's the whole story. Okay, if you want to know more, stay, otherwise go back to bed. Some introduction for the study. In the old days, literacy meant that you could read and write, and that's it. But now we have multimedia, which means that we do not only have print, but we have an integration of text, images, sounds, and it's presented in a digital way. So that's the definition of multimedia. And the examples are, as you all know, TV, DVDs, all sorts of computer software, electronic books, talking books, e-books, whatever you call them. There's internet, video games, we have smartphones, we have interactive toys, and lots of more. And literacy is now that you not only process the print, but that you are able to communicate through these multimedia applications. And there's a good reason. I've just given the summary of the whole talk. Anyway, if you want to get in touch with me, take a card. Okay, you can easily catch up. There's lots of redundancy in the talk. And there's a good reason to use multimedia because from a psychological point of view, it can be more efficient than just verbal or written delivery of the instruction or of whatever you want to present. And the people in the field who worked on it is mainly Pavio and his collaborators. And actually, I refer here to a 1991 publication, but it started already in the 60s, this sort of research. Because it dealt with whether you present something verbally or you give a picture with it, that sort of things. And the National Association for the Education of Young People, already in 1996, said that we should promote these multimedia applications. Okay. But there's still a bit of debate. People who are in favor of using multimedia say, okay, there's dual coding. You memorize things in a visual way and in an auditory way, and if you get a bang on your head, there's still one trace available. If you have two, you can lose one and still have the information available. And also, from a point of view of education, it is that if you work with multimedia, you support the children who really need to work with it because you can't avoid them. There are a couple of people who are against it, and Krishna is an example. He wrote an article showing that if the child is not at a certain stage of development, these multimedia effects may not be there, or may even be adversive. More recently, there is some research by Zimmerman and his colleagues, and they report that TV is very bad for children under the age of 3. There was a recent article in the New York Times 2 weeks ago. Then there is, of course, a lot of teacher resistance, and you heard other people talking about it, that there is an unfriendly market out there. And some people have argued that it costs a lot and produces little. Well, it does not cost a lot, and it can produce a lot. And then we have these very negative remarks by some people who say that children should play and not play with computers. Okay, anyway, there are a couple of reviews available in which all these things are discussed. The practice, however, is different. There is research which is already 5 years old, and it shows that very many children use computers a lot of the time. And I think, honestly, if you would repeat that research now, that you would find that any child uses a computer or any sort of multimedia very frequently. But we don't have any in-depth research on whether it really works. Okay, what we have is an article by Camel and colleagues. They reviewed 350 articles on multimedia and their effects on literacy. But only very few related to early literacy. And what they found is, but that was just a hunch, that multimedia could facilitate comprehension through mental model building, as they call it. And they could especially be beneficial for children who come from a language minority or cultural minority. An overview by Lancashire and Knoble found only 22 articles focusing on young children. That was in 2003. And the majority of these 22 studies dealt with decoding. So it's rather limited in scope. But there were some effects, but it was at that time radically under-researched, as they call it. In 2009, 22 quantitative and 16 qualitative studies on technology and literacy were reviewed by Burnett. And the rather disappointing finding was that the technology was used in the same way as the traditional materials were used. So it didn't have any added value. And the strength of multimedia were not exploited at all. So therefore, it was very hard to find substantial effects of multimedia. In 2009, McKenna and colleagues, they looked at the effect of e-books, and they only had available 7 randomized trial studies, which is very few. And they found small to medium effect sizes for comprehension. Effect on decoding could not even be assessed because there were only 2 studies that reported on that. And there were also some negative results in the narrative studies because sometimes more time was spent on the games than on working with the instruction and on the teaching and the learning. There is quite a lot of research on computer-assisted instruction, and there is some research in the early 70s, and well, the main conclusion at that time was it was promising, but these main frame computers, they were too big, too expensive, too slow, etc., etc. And things have radically changed since. The meta-analytic studies that were done in the early 90s found very small effect sizes. It was somewhere between 0.15 and 0.25, and that's, well, it's a bit, but not more than that. And there have been a couple of qualitative studies, and the outcome of the study by Torgerson and Horn was that the computer really should be integrated, otherwise it won't work at all. If you don't combine it with traditional instruction in some way, it would not work. Concentrate in 1994, but that's long ago, it was found that if you concentrate with a computer program on a specific subskill, then you may achieve something. If you concentrate on teaching reading as a more general thing, you won't achieve anything. That's too big. Talking computers are very promising. There's nothing new these days. All these computers can produce speech and understand speech. And again, the National Reading Panel in 2000 declared that talking computers are promising. Good. The only available quantitative study is the study by Block and colleagues, and they reviewed 45 studies with altogether 75 experimental conditions. The overall effect size was 0.25, and that's in line with the other research I showed you. So 10 years ago, effects were very small. I'll skip that because that's not very interesting. But overall, it was disappointing, especially because they reviewed very many studies in which children at risk took part. So the question for the research I'm going to present now, of which I already gave a summary, is have these applications become more effective over the last decade? Okay, the first question is, can multimedia facilitate the early literacy development of young children at risk of literacy underachievement? And if so, how? So, which literacy-related learning outcomes are most influenced by the use of multimedia? And then we have work in progress. We look at which multimedia applications are more effective. Are there any multimedia applications that interact with certain literacy outcomes? And we would like to know what really works in multimedia. So what sort of parameters make them work even better? We looked at everything that was published in peer-reviewed journals between 2000 and 2010. We limited it to children from 0 to 8, so young children. And we looked at children at risk for literacy failure for whatever reason. But we also looked at mainstream children to look whether multimedia application would be especially beneficial for children who were at risk. And we examined studies that had at least one of the outcomes that have been used since the National Institute for Literacy developed these outcomes. So that's, for most of you, a familiar list of outcomes. And that had to be published in English. Well, these are the details. You can always ask me about how we exactly did it. These were the databases we searched. And we came up with several hundred of articles. But in the end, we thought there's only 92 that are interesting. And we again reviewed them. And we had to exclude 16 from 51. And those 16 were excluded because the necessary information was not given in the article. So, bad reviewers. 24 reported on children at risk. 7 studies were on second language learners, so ESL learners. 7 on low SES. And 10 studies with underachieving readers. And the applications were the things I already told you: embedded multimedia, subtitled video, ebooks, and computer-assisted instruction. The results. Okay, here we go. For alphabetic knowledge, we found an effect size of 0.64. People have explained during the conference about effect sizes. So if what we ideally would have is effect size of 2. An effect size of 1 is absolutely fine already. But an effect size of 0.64 is a medium effect size. But it's promising. But there's quite some variation. It varies between about 0.50 and 0.80. But if we look at untreated children at risk, we find an effect size which is even larger, with a lot more variation. So you do not only look at the experimental groups, but also at the control groups, who do nothing or do an alternative program. Phonological awareness, there's a medium effect size, but in untreated children we don't find anything. So with respect to phonological awareness, these multimedia applications are very effective. Thank you. You cannot train RAM, not with multimedia. Concept of prints, that works fine. There is an effect on vocabulary, but it's equally big in children that are not treated. Comprehension, it's a medium effect size, but we have very few outcomes in control groups. Decoding, it's a medium effect size. Reading, there's an effect size, but also children learn to read without a specific multimedia treatment. Spelling, it works, but syntax, too few studies. Okay. I think that this is the first study to indicate that, if you look over the last 10 years, that there is a reasonably medium effect on the learning outcomes of children at risk. The large effects are there for phonological awareness and concept of print, and medium effects for comprehension and non-word reading. And multimedia applications do not have an effect on alphabetic knowledge, vocabulary and reading, as far as we know now. And if we looked only at studies that used appropriate control groups, we still found medium effects, which is fine. Okay, the effect sizes are larger, double the size of previous studies. We are around 0.50. In previous studies it was maximally 0.25. So we have apparently learned a couple of things about using the multimedia. What we have exactly learned is our work in progress. And also maybe we have changed using them. So we will also look into that. We need definitely more replications. I mean, the number of studies I'm talking about is all we could get, but we need much more, especially in some areas. There is some publication bias. I had to exclude 16 studies because people could not deliver what I wanted to see, and especially with respect to comprehension, but also vocabulary, some more research is needed. Okay, that's my talk. I have more if you would like to see that. Questions?
So I have a question about the studies you did include. Did you look at implementation or implementation variation as a factor in effect size, or was that information even available?
In some studies, they report treatment fidelity and that sort of aspects. We have not yet looked into that, but that's one of the parameters we are going to look at.
Because it seems to me that implementation fidelity is probably the most important factor,
yes.
Whether it be a multimedia program or a direct instruction program with a really good curriculum. And so it's one of the things that I think causes the most variation. I'll say from my experience reading the literature, it's one of the things that academic researchers don't pay enough attention to, because they're used to doing studies. They're not used to running a classroom in a K-12 setting. And so they come in, they do their research, they go out and move on, right? Whereas the teachers are still there trying to figure out how to educate the kids. So studies, my final comment is, from what I've seen, is studies where the researchers are observing and collecting data and the teachers are implementing tend to be better run studies from an implementation perspective.
I think you have a good point. The one reaction is that I think in most studies the multimedia were very intensively used. It's a different thing than because very many researchers could follow how many clicks there were, what sort of hot spots were clicked, etc., etc. So there is some indication that these things are used intensively. The other thing is that most of these studies have relatively short treatment periods. So a couple of weeks. I have computed for each study the average number of minutes children worked with the applications, and I expect that if you increase the time on task, that we will get effect sizes of 2. And then there's another thing. In the old study, in the study by Bloch and his colleagues, they reviewed all the computer system instruction 10 years ago. They had a long list of parameters. Also the duration of the treatment, etc. A long list, 30 things. But there were only 2 things that made a difference. But now we have higher effect sizes and a broader range of effect sizes. So I'm hoping that we find more parameters that could play a role. But that needs still to be seen.
Were you surprised that the low effect was on some of the things that I would think technology could deal with more effectively? When your low effects were on the alphabet and things that seem to be readily be able to be taught on a computer. I'm surprised their effect was so low, and I guess that's related to the design or time or...
Well, in most languages we have 26 letters, and all children will learn them sooner or later. So this is not an area where you have to experiment very precisely, and then you can see what a week of training with a specific thing does. And I'm convinced that the effects, that sort of effect sizes will be bigger. But this is just, I throw it all in a big bag. That's a meta study. And then these sort of things can come out. But still, that would be my interpretation, and that's what we're working on, is see, okay, we find larger effects there, how come we find small effects there, and these are unexpected. Why can that be? Yes. Thank you.
One of the things that Richard Clark has talked about for a long time is to try and get away from asking questions about whether technology works, but asking questions about how technology works. And since you're continuing this work, I would certainly encourage you to explore a little more closely questions and how it might explain the effect size variability that you notice.
Yeah, well, the thing was that there was not much available. So I first had to go and look whether there was an effect. So for e-books, for example, there was almost nothing available. We find some effects there.
Yeah, I think it's
much more. And then the question is, how come? And that's what we're currently doing.
I think, it's interesting and of course important to look at the particular subpopulations, but were you to cast your net more widely and instead of looking only at at-risk learners, just look at learners of all types, you might have, in a much larger sample of studies, more opportunity to look at instructional quality.
Yeah, the reasoning behind the selection now was that normally progressing children will learn anyway. And on the other hand, if you have all these modern technologies available, you would like to exploit them, especially for groups at risk. So that was the reasoning behind it. If it works there, it's even better. Of course, and it will probably work in normally developing children. So at the cost of having a bigger net, I think I got less information about how it precisely may work in those children who need it the most. But that's
well, there's a lot of studies that don't necessarily of multimedia interventions for early literacy that don't necessarily provide subgroup data. The ones that we've done don't really provide a lot of subgroup data, and by not including those, you are potentially you have less information.
The point would then be that if they work in a certain way in normally developing readers, for example, is it the same for children at risk, or?
Well, I think that's a good empirical question.
Yeah.
Thank you.